Welcome back to Mean Streets, where each week we investigate the best, worst, and forgotten movies of film noir. I'm Luke Deckard.
And I'm Matthew Booth.
And today's case is 1942's The Glass Key, starring Brian Donlevy, Veronica Lake, and Alan Ladd. The log line for The Glass Key is politician Paul Madvig refuses to take help from a gangster and develops a friendship with another politician, Ralph. Later, when Ralph's son is murdered, the suspicion falls on Paul. Here we go. The Glass Key, another big noir hitter for us tonight. But we're joined with another guest, our third, I think, fourth or third, maybe third guest on the show. Julie Anderson. Julie is the author of the Whitehall thrillers and most recently The Midnight Man. Julie, you're no stranger to crime fiction and the world of noir, so it's a joy to have you with us.
No, thanks for inviting me. I was looking forward to be here, but I've written some bits of crime fiction, but I do like film noir tremendously, and also reading the books.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yes. So The Glass Key was originally released on the 1st of October 1942 in the U.S. It's a Paramount Pictures movie. It's one of the kind of the most famous and popular of film noirs. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the film, the question I have for you first, Julie, is do you remember your first introduction to noir, whether that was by a book or film, or which book and film was the kind of one that sort of tickled your fancy?
I don't know. I guess in terms of books, well, it's anything by Raymond Chandler, really.
Yes.
You read Raymond Chandler, and I would give my right something or other to be able to write prose like that.
You're not alone. You're not alone in that, Julie.
But he's, and a lot of people say that. So I guess it's his writing. In terms of film, I guess oddly enough, the one that I remember most is To Have and Have Not. Was you ever bit by a dead bee? That line. And Lauren Bacall singing, I seem to recall, with Hoagy Carmichael, who I like the music of Hoagy Carmichael too. So, so really it was To Have and Have Not, which then led me to the other Bogart and Bacall films. So there's The Big Sleep and Key Largo and so on, and then and sort of things followed from there.
Nice. Bacall and her goddamn singing. The first episode we ever did was The Big Sleep, and that I hate that I hate the sing song moment. I really do. I hate it. I don't know why.
We both hate it, I think. It comes out of nowhere. It doesn't really do anything. It's not as if she's singing in a nightclub or anything. She just seems to be doing it for some sycophantic friends that all seem to enjoy it more than Luke and I do.
Yes. Very true.
Oh, but I mean, at least when she's in To Have and Have Not, at least she's a nightclub singer, isn't she? She's supposed to be singing in a bar.
Yes.
It makes more sense than that.
It makes more sense. I mean, she still can't sing, but and she has got Hoagy Carmichael on the piano. So I mean, that's really helpful.
When this is a question for everyone, but we'll start with you, Julie. When did do you remember the first time you saw The Glass Key and or sort of remember what that first impression was like?
The first time, I think that the first thing that I remember being impressed by was the pace of the opening. Just catching it on one of these, talking pictures or something on TV, and seeing the start and just thinking, wow, that's really very pacey. And like so many of those 1940s pictures, there's no waste in it. There's no glancing into the distance. There's no atmospherics or the stuff that means that films these days have to go on for at least 3 hours. It's all everything is used. There is no waste in that, and that's what really impressed me the first time I saw it.
I have to agree with that. I was thinking as I was watching it this time around, the opening it really moves at a cracking pace. It sets up everything. It sets up Paul Madvig really, really well. and then slowly introduces you to to Janet and to Ed and that whole world and the gangsters and stuff. It moves. That first 5 minutes is cracking stuff. Matt?
The very first time I saw this was for an episode of one of your other shows, Luke. We did a film noir, a general film noir episode.
Was that the first time you saw it?
That was the first time I'd ever seen it.
I forgot.
Yeah, so I'm quite a newcomer to this film. But I think I said when we discussed it last time, very much as Julie's just said, the pace of it is absolutely brilliant. Yeah. And I was struck by the first time and again rewatching it the many times since how uncompromising it is. It literally pulls no punches. And the scene with William Bendix in the upper room of that dingy apartment block is blood curdling. And given that this is 1942, there's a fair bit of violence in this film, which always strikes me as being very well shot and well presented, but also quite unforgiving. And it's a hard-hitting film. Again, literally, it's a hard-hitting film. But I agree about the pace. I think the opening scenes are absolutely breakneck speed. And they do so much. They set up so much that is important later on.
Yes.
I'd forgotten the scene where Brian Donlevy throws his shoe at William Bendix and then Lad kicks the door in his face, as he coming back to... And that sets up why Bendix sort of enjoys what he does later on so much. It's... there's a lot of setup and payoff in this film.
Yes.
Yeah.
All of which is done quite economically.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the economy that I think I really admire in it. I mean, the one thing, I think you're right as well about it being uncompromising. I mean, the one, well, there are several moments, but one moment that when it does compromise, and it's because it's forced to, because of the Hays Code, I suspect. Yeah. When Ned is seducing the wife of the editor, and essentially what you have is two fully clothed people sitting on a sofa. Now, I mean, these days you see them disappearing into a bedroom if you wanted to be subtle, or having, some sort of simulated activity if you didn't. But at least it would be there. But I did find that very, very difficult. Oh, he's supposed to be seducing this woman, and they're sort of lying on a sofa.
And I think there are certain shots where you only see it from the back of the sofa is facing.
That's right. Yeah.
So you just see the two heads sort of bobbing around like mannequins at the top.
Which I thought was really... I
suspect that is Hays Code.
It was the Hays Code. There was a lot of drama with the making of this film, kind of leading up to it, really. So we can go behind the camera and chat about that stuff, and then get into this nitty gritty stuff. So this is not the first adaptation, which I found interesting. This is something I didn't know at the time when I watched this the other day. It's only something I recently found out. So they did another version in 1935, directed by Frank Tuttle. Wasn't very good, was basically a flop, and was also heavily redacted from the source material. Like today, we kind of always complain about remakes. There's so many remakes, everything's remake, but this is the second version, technically the third, because there was a radio drama of the Glass Key in between this and the original film. So it's funny that we kind of complain about remakes, but it's something that Hollywood has been doing for a very, very long time.
People forget that the Maltese Falcon is that not like the fourth remake, or third or fourth, certainly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Because there's Satan Wins the Lady, or whatever it's called, and there's one called the Maltese Falcon in the early 30s. So yeah, you're right. The films have been remade, since cinema got into its stride, I suppose.
Yes,
but we do complain about it more than they seem to complain about it in the 40s.
For sure. So it's directed by Stuart Heisler. He has an incredible amount of credits. Started off as an editor in the 1920s, and then took to directing in the 1930s. And The Glass Key was his sixth film. Quite accomplished director, I would say. I think the directing of this film is pretty on on point. But take like that scene, if we can use that scene you mentioned a minute ago, but I will talk about it in more detail a bit later. But that scene with Ed and Mrs. Matthews on the sofa, I think the way he generates visual drama from that is obviously you're not seeing the seduction, you're not seeing any of the hoity-toity, whoopee that's going on. But having Mr. Matthews just come down the stairs and see over from the back of the sofa what's going on and know what's going on, and his sort of frustration and brokenness from that moment. I mean, that to me, it's like that was a really great way of conveying the awfulness of what's sort of happening in that moment for him, I think, but also the sleaziness of what's going on with Ned or Ed. His name is Ed in this movie, although his name was Ned in the book, which there's a bunch of changes, but we'll get to those in a little bit. Do you know much about the writer, John Latimer?
No, not a great deal, but I think he was. I know he was a journalist before doing this.
He was in Chicago, wasn't he? He was Chicago.
He was on the Chicago
Herald.
But I don't know a great deal about him, I have to say.
Yeah, so he was a big journalist in the back in the day, but I think what also was really cool is that he was also a hard-boiled writer. So he had a PI series of his own with a detective called William Crane, which it was a mixture of hard-boiled fiction with sort of comedy, which is interesting. I would love to go and find these books and read them because I haven't read them yet. But it reminded me a little bit of like from what I was reading, it reminded me a little bit of sort of like The Nice Guys, which is very hard-boiled, very noir, but with all sorts of shades of comedy happening and silliness along the way. I love when writers like this are doing the screenplays. I feel like they work so well when that happens. I mean, one of the reasons we loved Lee Brackett was, she knew her tough. She knew how to write tough guy stuff, and she did really well with that. And I think Latimer does very well here. And he's no stranger to writing mysteries after this. So this is his third screenplay. But he also goes on to write 32 episodes of the Perry Mason TV series, and also wrote an episode of Columbo called the Greenhouse Jungle from the second season.
Did I read somewhere, Luke, that Latimer had actually met real gangsters? That when he was on the newspaper, he actually used to go and interview the Al Capones of the day.
He had a meeting with Al Capone and Bugs Moran, and many others. So he was in there. He got up and close and personal with these gangsters. That's something else again. It'd be really fun to do more research on and find out what those interviews were like and see if I could find those interviews. I didn't have time to find them for this, but he seems like a really interesting guy. And again, I think for this guy, for Latimer to tackle the Glass Key is almost like a perfect fit, because it's all gangsters. There's no heroes. There's no, lone wolf private eye. It's everyone is a villain, in my opinion, in this movie. Even though they try to make Ed heroic, he's still, in my opinion,
not though, is he?
A villain.
No, not at all.
He's not at all heroic.
If anything, Paul Madvig is more sympathetic than Ed. I would have thought.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. Actually, I think I would have. You do cheer when he comes and saves Ned or Ed, whatever we're going to call him, from getting another kicking.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, there are very few sympathetic characters in this. Certainly no heroes. I think we're probably best calling them protagonists, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Now, this sort of leads into the Hayes drama with the Glass Key, but Latimer, he seems quite used to the fact that he writes things that get him into trouble or get his work censored. So he wrote a book called Solomon's Vineyard in 1941, featuring his private eye, Carl Craven. And there were scenes in there with like open references to the detective's like sex drive, but also descriptions of sexual practices as well. And the novel was considered, quote, too hot for his American publishers and wasn't released until 1950, but it was a heavily edited version. So it's funny to me that he's written this book that had to be quite censored, and there were a lot of worries with the Glass Key between the first one and the second one about how they would handle this. So before this version, the 1942 version, was kicked off, Paramount was already worried about the content of the book because it paints America in such a bad light. So there was a quote that says the Hayes office replied, the novel was objectionable because it painted an exaggerated picture of a large American city as politically corrupt and crime-ridden slums. Now, the book does, but I think that it reminded me of Raymond Chandler's quote in his famous essay, The Simple Art of Murder, in which he says, he says hardboiled fiction depicts a world in which gangsters can rule nations and almost rule cities, and that's exactly what's happening in The Glass Key. And it's interesting. This was such a controversial thing at the time.
Well, I guess it sort of is and sort of isn't. I mean, I don't think that the corruption would have been anything new to readers or viewers of the time, but whether they would consider that their own country, the glorious America, was corrupt, I think would be the question. Actually, I mean, corruption has been around forever. But I would imagine that the powers that be in the US rather thought it should be focused overseas and not at home. I don't know. I mean, I like the whole milieu that's created. That it's the negation of the negation, isn't it? If you look at the sort of contrary forces within a novel, that which is contrary, that which is opposite, and that which is the ultimate, the negation of the negation. And I mean, that's what this is. It's not just a lack of justice at an individual level. It's the fact that there is no justice because corruption rules.
Absolutely. And Chandler's quite right that about the nation being ruled by gangsters, and because it's one of his big themes. It's one of his major themes in Chandler's work, and it always
very relevant today.
Well, absolutely, absolutely, and it always makes me smile when film studios and censors generally say, "Well, we can't put this on film." When the person who might want to go and see that film can just as easily go to the library and get the Glass Key book out and get the same message. So and probably get it in a less filtered and less diluted way, of course. I remember thinking, well, if I can't go and see The Exorcist, for example, I'll just go and get the book out of the library. Or if I can't go and see Jaws, I'll just get the book out of the library, and both of them more terrifying than either of the films, sort of thing. So there's that sort of censorship, sort of pointlessness that I always raise an eyebrow at. And I think that's at work here. Paramount don't want to show that America's corrupt. Well, you can go and get any number of books that will show you that it is. And it's the same over here, same in the UK. And as you say, Luke, it's never been more sort of relevant than it is now. That's what amazes me about these books and these films, that because their themes are so universal, because it's all about, the dirty dollar that everything is founded on, they remain relevant.
It's an interesting film for Paramount to want to push out, and part of this, I think the reason for wanting to push it out so quickly was because of the Maltese Falcon had come out. The Maltese Falcon was a big hit, and they're like, what else do we got by this guy? What else we got by Dashiell Hammett to give to the people? And they got the Glass Key lined up, because it's during the interwar period, a lot of their films, a lot of films in general, were very focused on patriotism. Censors really wanted to ensure that that the American patriotism values were displayed on screen. That's what people were seeing. Yes, we're the good Americans. We're the good. So anything that went against that was typically suppressed and blocked. So it's fascinating that the Glass Key sort of got through at that time, because it's very much against the message of the 1940s and like that 1940s American, I guess you could call it propaganda a little bit. So I found that incredibly interesting. Because like I said, the film tackles things like political corruption, media corruption in this sort of post-Depression era, and the Glass Key itself, the book, it's not sentimental about America whatsoever. None of Hammett's books are sentimental. I mean, you read The Red Harvest, and that just eviscerates, the American dream right there. It's nothing but bloody mess.
I think it's right to say that Paramount were thinking about doing Red Harvest.
They were going to do that before this. Yes.
With Alan Ladd, because Ladd had been such a success in this Gun for Hire.
Yes.
That as Hollywood tends to do, they say, right, well, we'll wheel him out again in the same type of film and replicate the success. So we'll keep doing it until people get sick of it. Marvel Studios, for example. The idea that they were going to do Red Harvest, which, as you say, Luke, is perhaps as strong, if not even stronger, an indictment, just is crazy. It makes no sense to me at all.
The thing I was going to say, I mean, two things about this Gun for Hire, written by Graham Greene, amazingly, which I just did. I when I was doing some research on film noir posters, when pulling together a mood board for the cover designer of my latest book, I actually came across one of my favourite posters, film noir posters, which was for The Third Man.
Oh yes,
which was lovely with the archway and the silhouette of the man and so on, which was a great film poster, I thought. But they build, and Graham Greene, the most famous Englishman who never won the Nobel Prize, they bill him as by the author of this Gun for Hire. And I just thought that was so perfect, that Green's getting this billing. And I had never seen this Gun for Hire, and I actually went and found it afterwards after seeing that and see what it was like. And I wasn't that impressed. But then I have to confess, I'm not that impressed with Alan Ladd. So I'm not a fan.
That's something I definitely want to talk about very shortly. Very shortly, yes. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad. Okay, yes, definitely talk about that. The last thing I wanted to mention, though, about sort of the politics behind the film is it's also interesting that Hammett himself was arrested and jailed for being a suspected communist. He very much pushed back against the system. He was brought to the Supreme Court for questioning and wouldn't give up names of suspected communists. So then he was jailed. It's a real shame because Hammett was such a good writer, and he has a bunch of quite lengthy short stories that are the Continental Op stories. But again, sort of like Chandler, who has a bunch of short stories, they're novels. They have a few novels. But I think if you compare writers today versus back then, their body of work, their four to five ish novels, just the way in which they shaped American crime fiction and then affected British crime fiction and then film noir it's really quite incredible what those two guys, Hammett and Raymond Chandler, did for just the genre in general. I think to me it's quite remarkable.
It is. I would agree with that, and I would sort of just very briefly, Hammett takes Hammett's the blueprint, and Chandler sort of refines, for want of a better word, the sort of rougher edges of Hammett by giving poetry to it. And that to me is very similar to, Poe has the initial idea and Conan Doyle refines it.
Yeah.
To me, there's a sort of, synchronicity there between at different stages in the evolution of crime fiction as a genre. And then I suppose you could say, for a certain length of time, Christie then refines or turns Doyle into something else that then stays with British crime fiction to this day, but the fundamental point is the same. Yeah, absolutely. Hammett starts this kicking against what crime fiction was, and Chandler takes that ball and runs with it. And they're giants in the genre. There's no denying that.
Yeah.
And it's a shame, really, that for me that Chandler sort of eclipses Hammett.
Yeah.
In many ways, simply because all the parodies of film noir and private eye fiction are all parodying Chandler, who himself later parodied himself. Whereas Hammett's style is much more bleak and much more genuinely hard-boiled.
Well, I think if someone were to look at, for example, because my recent book, Bad Blood, it is private eye, it is hard-boiled, but there's probably more Hammett in my book than there is wisecracking Chandler.
Yeah.
But I think that's partly to do with era. Chandler, Hammett's writing in a post World War I world. You look at people like Ernest Hemingway and so on, and even F. Scott Fitzgerald. All of their writing is about disillusionment. There's this, everything is disillusioned. No one is happy. Everything is sort of glossy and fake, and there's this underlining sadness to everybody. And I think those writers, and I think in my book is set in that era. So it's sort of, I think there's a sort of attitude like that, whereas by the time you get to the 30s into the 40s, yes, you have World War II happening, but there is less, you're post the big crash, and I think they're trying to crawl out of the depression and find some sort of, I don't know. There's just a slightly different vibe to the Chandler versus Hammett era of.
Yeah. I think certainly that the Hammett is there's a loss of innocence about it, as there is a sort of loss of innocence, in a lot of the writers, including, Fitzgerald's the obvious one, but Hemingway too, and that's post World War One, post crash. And the start of the Depression, that somehow by the time you get to the mid-40s, people are starting to believe again.
Yes.
They're still quite cynical, but they actually believe that there is a better world, if you know what I mean. Whereas there's a lack of innocence and a despair in sort of the writing of the 20s and late 20s and early 30s, which I think has gone by the time you get to the 1940s to a degree. Though it's interesting. One of the things I picked up on that you said, Matt, about the sort of the way that crime fiction is changed, and you go from Poe to Conan Doyle in the same way as you go from Hammett to Chandler, and then Christie comes along, and you get this quintessentially English version of Conan Doyle. Not that that's not in itself quintessentially English, but Christie never touches on the politics, to my knowledge. I would not claim to have read all 84 novels or novels and short stories, but to my knowledge, she doesn't touch on the sort of political corruption that occasionally Conan Doyle does, and Poe certainly does.
Conan Doyle certainly does. Yeah, Conan Doyle certainly does. No, I don't think she does necessarily. She doesn't. Yeah, she's much more interested in the domestic side of things, which is why there are always so many country houses and villages and things like that. The outside world is an intrusion that she doesn't really want to happen, I don't think. Which is part of that classical whodunit trope, isn't it? That it's they're generally isolated people in isolated circumstances. Even if that's
sort of Jane Austenization of the crime novel.
yeah, well, quite, yeah, absolutely. But
that was something that I investigated with my PhD, because I kind of compare American hardboiled fiction to British, golden age fiction, and golden age fiction. The Holmes, Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Josephine Tey, that sort of type of crime is all about seeing crime as an outside force, an infection that can be cured, and the Holmes, the Poirots, the whatever, they're the physicians who are going to get rid of the virus of crime. Whereas, and that's where it's a bit unrealistic. So by the end of your Holmes stories, your Poirots, the crime has been solved. The victim, there's no lasting effects from the crime on the victim. Everything is, chaos is restored and order is brought back. Whereas the hard-boiled writers are writing against that, saying, okay, yeah, you have your murders, you have your thieves, you have your robberies and stuff like that, but just because you catch the person does not mean that life goes back to normal. Doesn't mean that this corruption just isn't. It's not it's just built in. It's just what is. It's not an outside force. It's just
it's the fabric of society. It's part of the fabric of society. That's what, it isn't an external force. But British crime fiction continued to say that sort of stuff and still does. P.D. James railed against it a bit by saying that at the end of her books the characters are affected. There are consequences. There are and she was saying you can't just have order is restored in the sense that justice is done, but there are effects of that. Yeah. And some of her best books really do portray that. And so you get a nice blend of what the noir hard-boiled school is saying, and also what Christie and the Golden Age is saying. So she's a sort of marriage, a very flimsy bridge between the two.
It's interesting.
But yeah.
Would you say that what that made me immediately think of was the Scandi drama, The Killing, was it? The very first one of Sarah Lund, which was actually more about the impact of the crime than it was about the crime.
Yes, it was.
It was, about the impact on that small community, on the family, and so on. So it's almost takes what you were saying and turns it on its head, and it's not hard boiled in the way that Hammett or Chandler would recognise it as hard boiled, but it's sort of even harder in that it's directly relevant to individuals within the story, and the impacts that the crime and everything surrounding the crime has on them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
There were a lot of changes in the Glass Key from book to screen. One of them being, as I mentioned, for some reason Ned Beaumont was changed to Ed Beaumont. I really don't understand why that was the case. There's a few name changes that I just don't get. There was also this sort of need to try to portray Ed as less morally gray throughout the film. If you've read the book, the Glass Key was the first proper hard-boiled book that I ever read, and it was dark and gritty and slimy, and you just felt like you were entering into the abyss as you're reading it. You don't necessarily feel that when you're watching the movie, I don't think, but there's shades of it. But in the book, Ned he's really not he's not a good guy. You're like, wow, I thought this, he's the protagonist. I thought he'd be kind of a bit more heroic, but he's kind of a sleazeball. He's collecting gambling debts. He's basically kind of an enforcer-esque character in the book, but they eject that entirely. And I think that might be to the film's detriment a little bit, because he's just sort of, he's the muscle for Paul, but he's also meant to be this morally upright guy, but he's the muscle for a corrupt politician. And sometimes I think the film struggles to handle those two concepts. Am I wrong? Do we agree?
No. And what strikes me, I mean, I know you're using it as a sort of metaphor. Is metaphor the right word? But when you say Ed, whatever we're going to call him, is the muscle. Whereas Alan Ladd is one of the slenderest men that you can come across. He doesn't really. Is now the time to talk very quickly about Alan Ladd?
Let's talk about Alan Ladd. Let's talk about Alan Ladd as Ed Beaumont.
Alan Ladd is one of those actors for me who, when he's cast in the right role, he can be very good. So you look at things like Shane.
Shane is the obvious one, yes.
It's the obvious one. And you look at the Blue Dahlia.
Yeah.
He's good in both. He's very good in both those. He was also very good, I thought, as the Great Gatsby in not necessarily a very good film. But he visually...
He played Gatsby. He played Gatsby.
He plays Gatsby, yeah. And visually, he's not far from...
he suits that look of Gatsby, this handsome
blonde, good-looking, fit-looking man. But my idea of Beaumont is, because he is the muscle to a corrupt gangster, he's got to be able to do what he needs to do when those debts aren't paid. And the most we see from Ladd, apart from a couple of punches, Hollywood punches, is a kick in a shin.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit lame.
It's a bit lame. I mean, he should be able to put. He should be able to put. What's he called? Ralph, is he called? Or Taylor, whichever one he is.
Taylor's the son. Taylor's the son. Yeah.
He should be able to put him on his backside in 3 seconds flat, and he doesn't look to me as if he could.
Yes.
So I think it's. I understand why they did it, because they wanted to replicate the Ladd and Lake thing. It's again, it's like the Bogart and Bacall. It's the Hollywood thing of put these two together and we've got fireworks.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether they're right for the roles. And Ladd isn't right for this.
No. You really needed someone.
George Raft is better in the 30s version.
Yeah.
Because he does look like he could handle himself in an alleyway, whereas Ladd looks as if he'd be frightened his hair would get messed up.
Yes. When I think of sort of Ned Beaumont from the book, I really think of he is someone a bit older, someone a bit more gruff. Almost you could put Robert Mitchum in this role, or you could put Brian Donlevy in this role. He
Brian Donlevy
would have actually probably been a better. Yeah. He's tough. He's got big hands. You're like, that guy looks like someone, if you owe gambling debts, that's the kind of guy that you go and send to collect those debts, and they're going to pay. Otherwise, he's going to beat the crap out of you. Yeah,
there are a couple of Sherlock Holmes films where you think the casting's not right here. We should have had. If they'd swapped a couple of roles round, this would have been much better than it is, and that's true here. I think Donlevy would have been brilliant. Yeah, absolutely.
So basically, Alan Ladd should have been Paul, and Brian Donlevy should have been.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure Ladd's right for Paul, but he's closer. He's closer. He's closer to that than he is to Ned Beaumont.
But if you want, I guess you could kind of work into that like slimy, slick politician who's corrupt.
Yeah, but he's also got to be quite crude, hasn't he? And quite big. Sort of psychologically and emotionally quite big. And Ladd doesn't do any of that. I mean, the one thing I found quite odd was that I noticed, and one shouldn't notice this when watching films, but I noticed when you got the scenes where Ladd was supposed to be menacing, lots of the other characters and actors were reacting as if this man was menacing.
Yes.
And I noticed them reacting as if this man was menacing,
Yeah.
Now that's completely broken the sort of third wall, hasn't it? You're actually seeing these people pretending to be afraid of this person who quite patently is not frightening.
Yeah. And let's be under no illusion, you wouldn't be acting afraid of Robert Mitchum, would you? If Robert Mitchum walked in. Or some, if we were going to remake it, somebody like Russell Crowe, would have been a pretty decent Ned Beaumont, because I think that would be a fine bit of casting.
I mean, that scene between Ed and Taylor when Ed goes to take Opal home, and Taylor's like, "You're not taking her," and he's like, does a little sissy shin kick. I was like, I just thought, this Taylor, and then when it happens, that Taylor guy just falls over as if he's been just had the crap beat out of him. But I'm like, that Taylor guy was like 12 feet taller than you. Like he looked like a bigger, stronger dude who could have taken Ladd on.
Absolutely.
And I guess the thing is, it's like, part of what they liked about Ladd was the fact that Veronica Lake, who was 4'11", she's 4'11", she's a tiny, tiny lady. Alan Ladd is around my height, so he's like 5? He's like 5'8" or something like that, somewhere in that range. So they're sort of togetherness, like it's like the glove, the first and second finger.
I think he was more like 5'6".
Was he? Okay, right. So he's shorter than me.
She's the only actress that they didn't need to put in a ditch or put him on a box.
Yes.
Which is why they paired them together so often.
Yes, and that to me just wasn't a good enough reason. It's a bit sort of, we I guess we talked a little about the Bogart Bacall. They're together because Hollywood likes them together, and there's a part of me that thinks that part of the film's detriment was casting him in this role, because he just, as you said, he's not menacing. And even when him and I do not think that him and Lake have any chemistry in this movie.
No.
Like,
Not much.
they
can see
old reviews sung the praises of the chemistry, and I was like,
where is it
exactly where?
Yeah. They are infinitely better together in the Blue Dahlia.
Yeah,
in my view, infinitely better, and almost as if like they've sort of warmed up by the time they get to that, because I think that's 1946 or something like that.
Yes, it is.
But in this they are very, very stilted.
Yeah, he just sort of like sits there with that stupid grin and sort of stares at her and leers at her, and she sort of peeks, and I'm like, it's bad acting. It's just a little bit bad acting.
There's some very bad close-up acting from Ladd.
Yes,
when he's just got this asinine grin on his face.
Yes,
which is meant to convey that she's the most beautiful thing he's ever seen, and he might do something foolish for her.
Yeah, which no.
and it doesn't. It just makes him look simple, you know. And it's
simple.
It's not really as a whole. It's not a great performance from Ladd, I don't think.
I don't think so either.
No, I must admit, the one thing that I was more convinced about, but this I think is partly to do with the quality of Brian Donlevy, was the relationship between two men. Actually, that was much more convincing as a relationship, I thought, than the relationship between Ladd and Lake.
Yes,
I think you're right. I think you're right, though, Julie. I think that's more to Donlevy's credit than it is to Ladd's.
Yeah.
I have this thing about certain actors who, when they're on screen with somebody who is obviously better than they are, they have to really up their game, and you can see it. So I think things like Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
Cruise has really got to work hard to keep up with Nicholson in that. And I think Ladd and Donlevy are in the same sort of camp. Not that Donlevy is anywhere near as good as Jack Nicholson, but he's got more experience than Ladd seems to have, and he does make Ladd run for his money.
He does. That scene where after Taylor's been murdered and Paul Madvig is brushing his teeth.
Yeah,
and he's like, so Ed's like, I found Taylor dead, and the way that was because early on in the movie, I feel that Paul was a bit too comedic, a bit too goofy, a bit too silly, and it sort of grated on me a little bit. He just sort of stupidly falls in love with Janet for a reason, and then goes all out for her. So, but when they got to that scene, you know, he's like, his sister has been found, you know, together with the opposition, and he's going to wants to take care of it. And then you kind of have this worry of like, did he do it? Did he not do it? And the coldness of his performance of like how much he doesn't care when Taylor is found dead. You are sitting there thinking, okay, this guy now is a little bit scary. Paul is scary, not Ed or Ned, but Paul is definitely scary in that scene. And the coldness of his performance, I thought, was really, really good. That's when I got on board with Paul. Is more in those moments where he's able to really dig deep into that chilling gangster aspect of his character, I think.
Well, he sort of channels Tony Soprano at that moment, doesn't he? I mean, you know, that sort of, you know, it's all about power and nothing else matters.
Yes,
which I thought was quite interesting.
I do agree that he's a bit too pantomime
wet.
Yeah, at the beginning, he's a bit too sort of. You know, winking at the audience a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me push this man through a window.
Yeah, I'll throw this man through a window, sort of thing.
Yes.
You know, whereas when he starts to change for me when he's pulling his socks up in the office, and you know, they get the phone call to say that Nick's going to open up his nightclub that night, and he says, "Don't worry, I'll sort it out." When he gets on the phone to the cops, whoever it is, he says, you know, go in there with all guns blazing, essentially, and turn the place upside down. And his look, contrary to Ladd, he has a close up then that's saying to Nick and conveying very well. He's saying to Nick, "Go on then, do your worst," sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a world away from Ladd's close ups.
Oh
really
my gosh,
is, in terms of performance. And you're right that Donlevy was very good at having characters that had a rough edge. And a very sort of bruiser out exterior, but finding the compassion and the humanity within them. He was very good at doing that. When he was on form, as an aside, he's terrible as Quatermass, but that's a different story. I think he was riddled with drink then, but that's a whole different story.
Different story.
but in this, like he's doing that in spades. I think he's showing that Paul is a dangerous man.
Yeah,
but he's got something of a soft center beneath the toughness, and I think that comes through. But there are certain key scenes that one where he's pulling up the socks and he throws the shoe, the toothbrushing, the teeth cleaning scene, definitely. And when he comes to Ned's rescue, they're all great scenes.
Yeah,
you know, it's a bit of he goes back a bit too comic for me in the final scene where he says to this girl he's going to change his entire career for. He just says, "Oh well, if you want to go off with Ned, off you go." That's all well and good, but I'm keeping the ring. Bit too much of a joke for me at the end, but.
Yeah, that's a very big difference from the book, where in the book they do part similarly, where those two go off into the sunset, but they're very much, the friendship is ruined. It's sort of a Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway sort of moment in which everything that their friendship is decimated because of this woman, and it's over with, and they part. Not enemies, but they're definitely no longer friends. Whereas this, you sort of feel like, oh, they'll run into each other in the future and they'll be happy and it'll be fine, because you don't get a sense of the brokenness. And
it's almost as if if Paul's in town one day, they'll have him over for dinner. The ending of the book is much more noirish in the sense that everyone is left, sort of not quite pleased with their lot, to put it mildly. In this, they part as friends, and they're all laughing together.
It reminded me very much of The Big Sleep, where it was a silly happy ending, which is very anti to the book, and it kind of falls into that Hays Code thing where we need to have the happy ending, we need to have the hero moment. The guy gets the girl, and it's just like, do we need that? It's the people can read the book, as we said earlier, and see what that ending is. Why do we need to change it? Why does cinema require these sorts of silly changes?
I guess, just to play devil's advocate, because images are sometimes more powerful than words.
Food for thought, Julie.
Well, no, you think of propaganda. Propaganda is more about image than it is about text, than it is about reading. Here's the image that will shock you.
Yeah, and I suppose it's true even then that more people will go and see the film than will read the book, I suppose. And your average cinema goer, I suspect, wants to see the hero and the heroine, for want of although there aren't any in this, but nevertheless they'll have thought there was, go off together. They don't want to know that the two men who've been friends. There's the great line where he says, "I took that beating because Paul would have taken it for me." Yeah. They don't want to see all that undone by having them part as, if not enemies, hostile to each other. Maybe your average cinema goer doesn't really care about the niceties of what film noir endings should be, and they just want to see the credits roll with a smile on their face. I don't know. Maybe this is wartime after all.
This is wartime.
So it just made me think of always look on the bright side of life. But anyway.
I mean, actually,
which is what noir should never do.
Exactly. When you mentioned their match a second ago, the whole sort of Ed taking the beating because Paul would take it for him. That was another problem that I had with this movie, and that was I really couldn't pinpoint Ed's motive, his motivation for anything that he was doing. No. 1 minute he's packing up and leaving because he doesn't want to deal with Paul's gangsterness anymore for some reason, but then stays for some reason and takes all this crap for some reason, and it's all sort of meant to be rooted in their friendship. But I was like, he was going to leave because he was sick of it. So what makes if he was tired of it, why is he staying now? Like, that's right. And if
he's so cheesed off with Paul that he wants to leave, well then speaking objectively, what's wrong with Nick's offer?
Yeah, quite.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I thought, well, that makes sense. He should take the offer because he's sick of the guy.
Nothing wrong with it. And that would have been, it would have killed the film, obviously, because the story would have. But that would have made Ladd's version of Ned Beaumont a lot more interesting. If he switched allegiances, that would have made it a shorter film, but a more interesting character.
I think so. There was something that really bothered me as well. It was the beginning of the movie. And it's the scene where Paul walks into wherever that building is that they're walking into. I don't know if it's a government building or whatever. And Ralph and Janet are over in a corner, and everyone's saying their piece. Oh, that's Paul. He's a crook. And Janet walks over to him, slaps him in the face, and says, "Someone should reform you. You're a crook," and all that kind of stuff. Which is a fun scene. Mostly, but then Paul just falls in love with her instantly because she's done that. And it sets this, the editing at the beginning is very bizarre because you kind of think, okay, she's going to hate him throughout the movie. But in the next scenes that they have together, it's as if that never happened.
Yeah.
And the awkward bit is she doesn't start to dislike Paul again until after Taylor is killed.
Yeah.
So it's not even like she had the motive at that point to slap him because the Taylor situation. It's just she just does it, and then the next scene she's like laughing about him with her father, and I was struggling to sort of. As another one, struggling to sort of connect those puzzle pieces don't fit.
No,
in my opinion,
completely inconsistent as far as I can see. Often. There are lots of inconsistencies in the narrative, and certainly in the motivation of the characters. I mean,
it's one of those sequences. Well, a series of scenes, perhaps I should say, rather than sequence, that often they tend to make me wonder if there's some sort of cut out footage.
Yeah,
and maybe the film was 10 minutes longer than the one we've got now. That explains all that because it's too. The number of rewrites that these sort of scripts go through, and are famous for going through, and actors being what they are, you'd think somebody would say, "Well, hang on, why am I punching him in the face in one scene and then agreeing to marry him in the next? What's happened in between those two extremes?" And and that very often to me that smacks of deleted material.
It does. And also we have two introductions to Ed, which is really bizarre because there's after Paul is slapped, he then goes to Ed and says, "Hey, Ed,
yes, absolutely.
Find this girl. Find this girl." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then they have the scene that's meant to be the real introduction where Nick turns up and we only see Ed from behind while he's at the craps table and he's, shaking the dice. And then there's this kind of what's meant to be that moment where he turns around, and that's your big introduction to the menacing Ed Beaumont, even though he's not menacing. But I was like, wow, we have two introductions here. One is like a fleeting introduction that's kind of almost like blink and you'll miss your big protagonist moment. And then you have your big protagonist introduction, but then is sort of undercut by the fact that he's this 4 foot, 5 foot something guy that's just scrawny. And I have to say, when he's sort of running around in the trench coat and fedora, he does look like a kid wearing his dad's clothes.
He does, yeah, he does.
Absolutely.
1940s suits are very famously sort of baggy, but his do look. He looks like Tom Hanks at the end of, or the kid who's Tom Hanks at the end of Big. It's bad. He's too slim. He's too slight.
But what's interesting about this discussion is that we all really like this film. We've just eviscerated a couple of the two of the three main actors in it. We've said that it looks like it's been cut because it has no consistency. So what are the really good things about this film that actually outweigh all that crap?
One thing for me is the I would say subtle, because it could have gone darker, but I would say the subtle messages that are being conveyed throughout. I think Lake puts on a pretty good performance. I like her. I also like the nurse who's in it for about 2 seconds.
The nurse.
Yeah, the nurse is great. Yeah,
You know,
but you can't go outside; you'll get wet.
Yep, Paul is obviously the character of Paul for me is fantastic. Nick is also that I bought him as a gangster. Like it's all of the other kind of sub characters, supporting characters I think are really quite great, including Jeff, the big muscle played by Brian his name
William Bendix.
Bendix, yeah. He is fantastic. That's the kind of stuff that I like. One scene that I really like was the DA's office scene, the very first DA office moment, where Ed goes in to find out what do the police know about Taylor's murder, and what do they know about its connection to Paul. And it's not Ed that I like in that scene, but it's the DA, who, whether intentional or not, his hair is really greasy, slimy, a little bit disheveled. His teeth are just disgusting and messy, and he's got that dead tooth in his front, and he's shifty, and you very quickly get a sense of political corruption, like corruption from the top going down, and you get it. So I like that sort of, whether intentional or not, that visual moment that we were getting. And again, if you could just take Ned out and replace him with someone else, you could understand why the DA was so sort of felt bullied and intimidated by Ed. And so that for me was a scene that I thought was particularly good, but from the other side, not from Ned's side, from the other actor's position, and like the writing of that scene I thought was quite strong.
Yeah, I mean it's a good point you make, Julie. We have absolutely tore it to pieces, but it is one of my favorites, and I think it's the charm that it's got, it's the pace, it's the it's the way that, as we said at the beginning, it's the uncompromising tone and depiction of what happens. It's its willingness at a time when they did want heroes and heroines and villains to have a film where there are no clearly delineated sides as such, in from the perspective of hero and villain, and that the worst, the best of them can be the worst of them, and vice versa. And I think that it's not a bad adaptation of the book, is it, Luke? I don't think so.
I wouldn't call it a bad adaptation. It's about as close to the adaptation as like The Big Sleep is to The Big Sleep.
Yeah, it's
awkward
there or thereabouts.
Yeah,
it's there or thereabouts. So as a depiction of the book on screen, I think it works very well. It's just that there are some niggling issues, Lad being the main one, and that's not a criticism of Lad per se. It's just that I think he's miscast.
Completely miscast.
Yeah. What about you, Julie? What are the scenes, the bits that really stand out to you?
Well, I mean, when I started, you asked me, what I remember most about watching it for the first time. It was that pace and that dynamism, actually, and that nothing was wasted. That everything had a payoff. Everything had a reason for being in there.
Yeah.
And I think I'd go back to that. And I would say that even though there are some inconsistencies, and you sort of think, oh, but I thought he was. Oh, well, but somehow you're sort of carried along by this sort of pace and dynamism and energy of the story. Oh, well, that's happening now. Oh, well, but that means, and you're automatically sort of rolling forward. And even though you're sort of part of you thinks, well, hang on. But that's gone. That you lose that question because too much else is happening. And
I think that's something that it shares again with The Big Sleep. Who famously, who plot is indecipherable. But you're right, I think there, Julie, and that again that goes to the pacing of it. And film noir generally, this sort of story generally, goes on at such a breakneck speed that it's only afterwards you say, well, who is he again? Or most famously,
why did he do that?
Yeah, or most famously, who killed the chauffeur? But while you're watching it or reading it, you're not noticing any of that. I don't think. I think it's when you come to deconstruct it like we're doing for this, that you start to notice all the little inconsistencies and things that don't quite match up.
The other thing that I really liked about this movie is something we kind of mentioned a bit earlier, was the fact that, the film was complicated because the studio were worried about the themes of the book and how that was going to be conveyed, and the fact that in one way or another the film doesn't entirely shy away from that. We have the corrupt DA, we have the corrupt politicians, and there's a really that great scene when Opal, Paul's sister, goes to Ed in the hospital, and she's like, the paper just said, that Paul definitely killed Taylor. I need you to tell me if it's true. And he's, Ned keeps saying, no, he didn't do it. No, he didn't do it. No, he didn't do it. And she's like, oh my God, he did it. He did it. It's in the newspaper. The newspaper wouldn't lie. And he's like, well, I hate to tell you, sister, they did. And it's like, we're talking 1940s fake news. Like, we act like, I think the kind of 2016-15 era was the birth of fake news, but the reality is this has been around since the beginning of news, and the fact that this film was really was willing to just be so blunt about it, and then you get that wonderful scene that follows at Mr. Matthews' country house, where Nick is there and Opal is there, and they're Ned explains the situation to Opal and to Mrs. Matthews, that the gangster has the publisher by the neck and is going to make him do and print what he says to gain his own purposes, and then further bankrupt the publisher and leave them all broke when he's done. And so I think for me, the fact that the film was willing to go that far to say, you cannot trust your politicians, you cannot trust your media, you cannot trust your people in positions like the DA, is quite bold, particularly at a wartime situation in which the narrative is America am good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a bold choice. It's a bold choice of project for those reasons, because those themes are there from the start. Yeah. And you can't pretend that you don't recognise that, and so that they must have known. But it is a bold choice to present that so vividly, and so, again, I use the word uncompromising on screen. And who would have thought that the media and the politicians are crooked? There's news, eh? There's news, and that's not fake news. But you're right, Luke. Yeah, you're right. And again, it goes back to what we said about these being universal themes, that power corrupts and it absolute power corrupts absolutely, sort of thing. That's what all this is about. This is what a lot of these stories are about. And you generally have one person who is fighting against that and trying to turn that tide, be it Marlowe or in Rebus, perhaps in Ian Rankin's books, or whoever. Yeah. But in this, you don't. You have somebody who's right up to his neck in it and is part of it, and isn't trying to turn the tide at all. He wants the tide to continue as it was. Yeah. What he's actually doing is standing up for his friend, even though that friendship isn't quite as well depicted as and set up as perhaps it should be. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is an interesting and very novel approach to this type of story, which generally requires somebody to be an investigative presence. Yeah. Somebody says to Beaumont, don't they? I think it might be Veronica Lake. Do you think you're some sort of detective then, or an investigative person? And he says no, and she says, "Well, I think you could be." Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether that's a sort of way of the screenwriter saying, we know that there should be one, but there isn't. So
we're not going to have one. Yeah.
You're not going to get one, or whether it's a character point. I don't know, but I think the fact that it does something different is something which should really be applauded for this film, and that it's things like that. It's those issues that can get me over the fact that Alan Ladd's about a foot too short and about 5 stone too slight.
Absolutely. But also, it's sort of, and that's what makes it stand out, though, isn't it? That's what I suppose this is what you said, really. I'm just reiterating it, but most crime drama, you have some sort of not necessarily a hero, sometimes an anti-hero, but you definitely have someone who provides a resolution somehow.
Yeah.
Of some kind. There is no resolution in this film. Not really. I mean, not that works anyway. I mean, the happy ending in inverted commas isn't really a happy ending.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, does anybody care? I mean, watching that, do I care whether Alan Ladd's character gets off with Veronica Lake's character? No,
not really. No, I don't really care.
I think you're meant to care about Paul Madvig getting cleared, but even that in the film, I'm like, I don't. Okay, cool.
I cared more about the Paul character than I did about the other two, I think. And I cared more about the Opal. I like the Opal character. The Opal character, I thought was actually.
Yes, I like Opal.
Yes.
I'm not sure why. One scene I do like is, and I think Ladd is quite good in this scene. So I'm gonna stand up for him since we've absolutely hung him out to dry. I think he's good in the scene with Bendix, William Bendix, who they were great friends in real life because Bendix he'd knocked him out completely. He'd knocked Ladd out completely. Which before I support Ladd, I'll just put the knife in again. There's no way he survives that beating from William Bendix. Not a chance. He's
not that little guy.
Too weak. He's far too weak. Anyway.
But he did. But as you said, he did take a punch from Bendix and was knocked out on the set of this movie.
On the set of this movie, so I suppose he can take a Bendix punch. I suppose can he take it hours at a time?
Can he take a beating? No, but he at least took one punch. He took one punch and was knocked out cold.
But the scene where he manipulates Bendix into killing Nick,
yes,
is a standout scene. And just going back to what you said, Julie, about resolution, that's as close to one as you get, isn't it?
Mm.
That's as close as you get to Ned in crime fiction verbiage, solving the crime, solving the case. Is getting he's getting Jeff to kill Nick.
Mm.
That is a resolution of sorts. And the way that Ladd does it, and the way he presents that dialogue and the way that is shot as well and performed, is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. It almost saves him from the rest of it, but not quite. But I think that is a standout scene for me.
Me too. You feel so much for Jeff in that moment where he's like, I've never really stood up for myself. Everyone just thinks I'm this, goof muscle guy. But now it's he's drunk and so he's not thinking straight, and he offs one of your big baddies that you need offed, but what's the way to do it? That was a great. That's another really great scene.
I just want to say a few words about William Bendix because he is great in this. He's also
fantastic.
He's fabulous in The Blue Dahlia as well, but he's really good in this. And I love his line where he says, "When I bite a steak, I want it to bite me back."
Yes,
that's a fabulous. After he's smothered it in ketchup or whatever it is, hot sauce, whatever it is.
Yes, the way they cook, though, on that little table, I thought that was wonderful, actually.
Yeah,
it's so domestic. I mean, you've got these
like a married couple. He says, "Where did you learn to cook?" He slaps his hunk of beef on his plate.
Yeah.
That's a nice little scene, and especially after the horror that's gone before.
Yeah. That's a fantastic. That whole section of the movie is probably my favorite. Actually,
and a fabulous stunt.
Yes,
I stand by the fact that wouldn't be out of place in a Bond film even today.
What are our final thoughts on The Glass Key?
You go, Matt. I can't.
Shall I go first? I think as a product of its time and as an example of its type, I think it's despite. This will sound shallow now, but I think it's brilliant. I think it really does capture the spirit of the book, if not true to the letter of it. It's filled with intrigue. It moves at a breakneck speed, and it is not afraid to do something different and to do it in a very stark and violent way. And I think, it's almost a sort of Tarantino film of its day for me. And I think with a couple of performance issues and casting issues, I think overall it's certainly one of the best. of film noirs of the classic film noir period.
Yeah, I suppose I would concur with all of that. It's also it has a sense of it being itself, of it being completely authentic to itself.
Yes.
It's not really like anything else. I mean, you can say you've got bits that then went on to be part of The Big Sleep or other elements, but and the whole corruption thing clearly has been used again and again. But the way it's all brought together in one package, I think is really, really good, and the pace of it and the lack of waste. There's something about movies of the 1940s. There was nothing wasted. No line was wasted. No look was wasted. It's all so focused on what it wants to achieve.
This is 86 minutes long, this film.
Yeah, I know. It's astonishing, isn't it?
These days, you're 86 minutes in before you've had the first sort of inciting incident. This sort of film. This film is a godsend for in terms of comfort in your seat. Let's put it that way.
Yes, what it accomplishes in that time, character-wise, narrative, it is very strong. Despite the criticisms I think that we have with casting and certain motivation things, it still sticks the landing thematically, which I think is really, really important. And it's nicely summed up by the DA towards the end, where Ed wants Janet arrested, and the DA says, "You're not dealing with ordinary people here." And again, that's a very powerful line for that time, because it's saying to the audience, you don't understand, these people are so rich and so powerful, they can do whatever the F they want. And again, if we take that commentary forward, well, we can think about what was happening at the time with the Second World War. We think about that now with what's going on in America with the political discourse that's happening there, that is not too dissimilar to what was happening in Germany in the 30s. It's very sort of it's a very powerful message, and I think the film focuses more on that and on the friendship between Ed and Paul, and those are the things that land spectacularly. The film doesn't care so much about the romance, and I think that's why that crumbles so much. But because it lands that the thematic message, you're pulled along with it, because it sticks so hard to that, I think. So despite my criticism, yes, I think it's, for film noir people, or if you're just coming into it, it's an important film to watch, because it's because of what it offers, particularly at that early stage of film noir. We have a rating system, Julie, where we rate all of our films out of between 1 to 5 falcons. So now it's time to rate The Glass Key, 1942. So out of 5 being the best, 1 being the worst, how many falcons would you give The Glass Key?
Ooh, sort of 3.5, I think, because I think there are too many. I mean, I think you're right about the thematicness and the authenticity and the themes, and but there are too many things that could have been better. To get a sort of 4 or a 5, certainly not a 5. I thought about 4, but I think that's probably a bit generous.
Matt,
rewatching it really struck me just how miscast Ladd is, and the romance side of it, as you just said, Luke. We've not really touched on Veronica Lake that much, but it doesn't come alive. I wonder very much whether you could get along, if you could cut Veronica Lake out of this pretty much, and not really.
Well, the fact that we haven't talked about her says a lot, because she doesn't offer much to the film. That's our Veronica Lake discussion.
Yeah, there you go. So I think on the basis that of those 2 points, but with a heavy repetition and repeat of the point that this is such a good film, and an important one, and thematically and all the rest of it, and uncompromising. But I am also going to give it a 3.5.
For me, I'm a harsh critic. For me, it's a solid 3. 3 is not bad. 3 is quite good. There's stuff that we've mentioned that we like about it, but those things that we dislike, I think, as we said, are very glaring, and it does shake it off of its foundation a little too much. So it is quite a skewed film for me, where again, if we compare it to some of the other bigger film noir movies, either back then or even today, if we say something like LA Confidential is a 5-star, this is nowhere near as solid as LA Confidential. And LA Confidential is a miracle that even works. So for me, solid 3. It's worth watching for the themes and some of the actors, and it's a good looking film. It looks good. The sets look good. The lighting, all that stuff is very well done. So there's a lot of things in its favor, but those plot issues, those character issues, and those and the casting issues, when you have someone poorly cast, it really affects the overall quality of a film. I think even if that person is a good actor, if they're not in the right role, it just and it's
such an important role.
Yes, if your lead is not right, it's you're gonna have problems, and I think this film has those. But there we are. Julie, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Julie.
Discussion of
my pleasure. It was good fun. I enjoyed it.
Good. Tell people where they can find you on the interwebs.
Right. Well, I've got a website which is amazingly called the julieandersonwriter.com, and actually that's my sort of handle for all sorts of things. So Twitter and Instagram and cool. So on. You can find me at Julie Anderson Writer, and I wrote the Whitehall trilogy, and I've just written The Midnight Man, published by Hobart Books. I'll get the puffin now. Found it, all good bookstores. Yes. And of course, Mr. Besso's Emporium, if you are so inclined.
Do find Julie, find her books, buy them, and follow her on social media.
Right. And do ask me again. I've really enjoyed this evening.
We would love to have you back. Absolutely, we will absolutely have you back.
Yeah, definitely. Glad you enjoyed it. As did we. Well, indeed. I did. Did you, Luke?
I did very much.
Excellent.
Very much.
Excellent. That wraps up our investigation into the Glass Key. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with another case. In the meantime, please like and subscribe, and be sure to take care walking down those mean streets.